welcome to the IDEMS podcast. My name's Lucie Planell, a social impact scientist and an anthropologist, and I'm here today with David Stern, one of the founding directors of IDEMS. Hi, David.
Hi, Lucy. I'm looking forward to today's discussion because I know the topic.
So if I just try and introduce it very briefly, it's really briefly, in 3 words even, it's simplicity versus complexity.
Right.
It's something we talk about a lot, I think. You always like complexity.
No, that's not true. I love simplicity. I just don't believe that the world works that way.
Yes, and I agree with that. But then I know that we always have to simplify things in order to understand them, or head around them.
That I might not agree with.
Oh, really? Oh, but that's why we subcategorize things. That's why we put things in boxes, because then it's easier. You can actually comprehend it.
No, the whole point is that if you do that, then maybe you're not comprehending it because you've reduced it to something which is
exactly. But this is the problem. To me, there's always the tension between them, that you have to do some categorizing, but you lose everything in doing so.
So the key point in your statement, therefore, that I disagree with is I don't think you simplify to understand it. I think almost by definition, by simplifying, you're not understanding the complexity.
Yes, simplify to actually make progress then.
Yes, that I could agree with. In certain cases, there's the need for simplification to make progress. I grew up with this in a way that actually many other people don't. And so maybe I should give a little bit of my childhood here. Because to say I was socially awkward is a slight understatement. I'm fairly typical for mathematicians, but I like the world in black and white. To me, simplicity was being able to know the difference between right and wrong. And that's why I loved mathematics. Mm-hmm. It was the only place where if I was wrong, someone could tell me I was wrong. And it was about the fact that I'd made a mistake. There was something which was wrong. It was objective. Mm-hmm. That objectivity was so important to me growing up. And I recognized that the world around me didn't work like that. It was much more complex. I still appreciate, as a teenager, living in niche air and watching people come in and do what I thought was amazing work. And then I was there long enough to see that after they left, it was a disaster. And it would have been better if they'd never been there, even though I thought the work they were doing was wonderful. And then I saw people come in who I thought were really useless. I really wasn't happy with them. And then they left, and the seeds they'd planted grew and grew, and they blossomed. And I found that level of complexity, and this is one of the reasons that although I was very interested in international development, I couldn't have studied something as hard as that. So I took the easy way out and I studied maths. I think contrary to what many people believe, but if you want simplicity versus complexity, maths to me always represented simplicity because you can tell the difference between right and wrong. You've reduced it down to something where you can know. You can understand. So I suppose at that point, I would have agreed with your statement. Broadly, mathematics was when you managed to simplify things down to things you could understand.
Is simplicity then something that you can, how are we defining simplicity? Is it something that you can understand? Is it something that is knowable?
Well, I think it's really interesting. And I guess in this is this really interesting tension that it was only when I went back out into the big wide world and actually felt I was ready to take on proper challenges, that I recognized that for all the maths I now had understood and knew, it was extremely valuable. But it didn't mean that I understood other things. In fact, all it had really done is opened my eyes to just how ignorant I really was and how little I understood. Because the things that I did understood were so much more than many other people. I had backgrounds in the mathematics, which helped me to understand underlying processes and all these other things in great detail, and to think through what is it that I'm understanding and what is it that I'm not understanding. But in all that deep understanding of those structures and that language, mathematics, as I see it, is a language which you can know, recognizing that despite having that incredible language, how little I really understand about the world around me, because the world itself is so incredibly complex. There's so much complexity in it. And that then led to this issue where actually, and I am really scared about this for the world as a whole, where actually even world experts in their domains are seeking simplicity at the expense of complexity, in ways where often that knowledge, and I'm going to take the field of economics, because there was this wonderful quote, and I really should get who made it, He's a Nobel Prize winner, so it's a name I should have at the tip of my tongue, but I don't right now. And he was saying how he has now recognized that the work that led to his Nobel Prize did not actually take into account elements of how society works and so on. And so he's pulling back on this. And this is something which I would recognize that there's a lot of the work in economics. And I know a bit about this because I've worked with people who work in economics quite a lot. And the search for simplicity, for simple solutions, to be able to explain the world, has often led to the complexity of the world to be lost at the expense of quite often community, quite often things that have less easily measurable value. And this is elements around, well, what you measure is what then people take on and so on. So there's so many different elements which relate to that I think there is a real need in general for, as a society, to recognize and work with complexity better. And I think at the moment, too much academia has got too obsessed by getting down to simplicity, so that they can produce results, whatever that means.
So simplicity there in terms of people working in silos within the disciplines, do you mean?
That's part of it, but more explicitly, even just the research methods that have become very popular, things like randomized controlled trials, which are determined as evidence, they are in certain contexts highly appropriate, where you have a red pill and a blue pill, and you're comparing the impact of the red pill and the blue pill, so to speak. But to lose the complexity of implementation when doing something complex, let's say in an educational environment, and to try to reduce it to red pill, blue pill, sometimes isn't the best way to do research. And actually recognizing that we need to do better at understanding what research evidence really is and could be and should be in the future, and how this should be a diverse range of things, not individual methods. And it's not that an individual method, randomized controlled trials, are world-changing. They have had such a positive effect on medicine and in so many areas. But to put them up as the best research method is not to understand the nature of research, what research should be. And that's people trying to simplify and say, oh, if you did a randomized controlled trial, then that's good. If you didn't, that's bad. That's just people who don't understand real research. It's all about what questions you're trying to find out and so on. And particularly when you have complex problems, when you're within complexity.
Exactly. Can we just take a second to discuss complexity then, or what is complexity?
I love to think of it mathematically, if you'll allow me.
Okay.
An easy way to think about it is the logo of IDEMS is a trefoil knot.
Yeah.
And the way I love to think about complexity in this context is if you reduce something to something two-dimensional, just two things, you can't get complexity.
Either is or isn't, sort of thing.
Yeah, you've just got somewhere maybe on that spectrum or whatever. The trefoil knot, to me, is a beautiful illustration. As soon as you get to three, there's multiple things you can be. And the trefoil knot is fundamentally different from something which is unknotted and just living without that complexity. So the trefoil knot is an instance of, if you want, as a knot, it can't be undone. It can't be reduced out so that complexity is removed. So just mathematically, if you think about that in this sort of context, that would be, to me, an illustration of what complexity is. You can have three things or three something triangle-like shape in three dimensions with this, where there are different possibilities. And then you don't just have one trefoil knot, you have two trefoil knots, because you could be knotted in two different ways. Is it a left trefoil or a right trefoil? And so on. And so you're starting to see that as soon as you go to three, and again, I'm really oversimplifying what is complex, but it is this element that as soon as you go beyond just thinking in binary, in two things, you can have elements of complexity which emerge in terms of how they're related to one another, how they interact, and so on. I love that illustration of an unknot, which is what everything which is not knotted is in knot theory. And then your simplest possible knot is the trefoil knot. And that's your simplest illustration of complexity. Now, for me as a mathematician, this really helps me to understand complexity, because you can have the simplest possible complex thing. Complexity is defined as something which is non-trivial. Now, non-mathematicians don't like to think of most things being trivial because they find them quite hard. So they get rather angry at you when you start saying, oh, that's trivial. And meaning that it's easy, it doesn't have complexity. So complexity is, in some sense, definable. A complex problem is one which you cannot trivially resolve. What does it mean to trivially resolve something? Maybe if you just throw enough money at it, you can solve it. If you have a non-complex problem, then maybe you just throw money at it and it will be sorted. So that's another way to think about complexity in the real world. If you could just solve it by putting money at it, then maybe that's a simple problem. If just throwing money at it doesn't work, then it's the complex problem. That's one way to consider it. And then when you start thinking like that, suddenly people recognize complexities everywhere. Because actually, yes, money is a limiting factor quite often, but it's very rarely the solution. Actually, just throwing finances at it often doesn't solve it. And people have tried this hypothesis on a number of occasions. I still remember the Millennium Villages, which were this big set of research efforts, where the simple hypothesis, and this was over 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, where there was the feeling that actually global absolute poverty was a simple problem where we now had, as the world, enough money that this was solvable. By just putting money at it, it should solve the problem. And they then wanted to demonstrate this with these Millennium Villages. By having villages where essentially they took money out of the equation, they said, look, by just putting enough money in, we'll resolve the problems of the community and the communities will function well. And it didn't quite work out like that.
Was that in the UK?
No, there were a number of these all over the world in different ways. Because they weren't so successful, they're not talked about very much. No, but this basic hypothesis was that actually, if we just put enough money behind it, there's now enough money in the world. It's just a question of putting those resources to bear on it. And this related to things like the Millennium Development Goals. And this is where the Sustainable Development Goals, I would argue, really came out of people recognizing complexity, that it wasn't just a money problem. And this should be part of that evolution, which I think has happened in people's recognition and understanding of the importance of complexity. But there's still circles within which people think the problems are simple, and they think of them in terms of simple solutions. The number of people who still are looking for or thinking about silver bullet solutions is surprisingly large.
And you see that in funding, calls for funding, that they often look for projects which will find a nice solution to all the world's problems.
Or even just specific individual problems, which are what I would consider to be wicked problems or grand challenges, where they're not simply solvable. And therefore, actually recognizing the importance and the need for complexity is central.
So you talked a bit about the problems of people using simple research methods. So what do more complex research methods look like then?
You're an anthropologist, so I should be asking you that rather than the other way around. But I suppose what I can say is exactly the element where we need to recognize the value of multiple approaches to research, multiple types of research questions, multiple sources of information coming from qualitative, quantitative, but not just that, coming from different types of research at different scales. Are we looking at small scale, a small number of people going very deeply? Are we looking at large numbers of people and understanding trends? What is it we're looking at and understanding? What are the questions and what's the variety of questions we're trying to find solutions to? Not solutions. I hate the word solutions. I keep using it and I don't like it.
Answers.
Answers, yes. Or actually making progress on is a better thing.
Find out more about, yeah.
Because often most good pieces of research I know end up asking more questions than they actually answer. So you end up with more questions rather than less. The more research you do, the more questions you have. It's very often a reality. But making progress in advancing knowledge, in advancing understanding, that's the key. And recognizing that in complexity, there's no single way to do it.
No.
By definition, you have to look from multiple angles, from multiple dimensions, to be able to gradually work through what's a component you can move the dial on. I come back to this sort of language of wicked problems, of which the grand challenges is another way of framing this, where broadly there aren't silver bullet solutions, otherwise you're not a wicked problem. It really is this element of recognizing that complexity and being comfortable working in that uncertainty.
Ah, yes. And I'm sorry, it's interesting that you're mentioning uncertainty now within the idea of complexity.
I would argue that most complex problems you have to accept that you're not going to get to certainty with your answers, because otherwise they wouldn't be complex.
Yeah, no, exactly. And which comes back to what we said at the beginning in terms of something being simple, being knowable then, or being more definite.
Yes. With mathematics, growing up, I recognized that I really couldn't deal well with complexity. I found humans incredibly difficult.
They're a pain.
It was really quite upsetting because I liked humans quite a lot, and I thought they were very interesting, but I just couldn't deal with them. They were just so complex. They did different things on different days. I thought I'd understood, and now you've changed your mind. Oh, that level of complexity of dealing with humans. As a youth growing up, I loved the maths because it was always the same. You could come back to it the next day and it didn't change, and it didn't change its mind, and it didn't think of something new. It was always the same. If you'd understood it yesterday, you still understood it today.
Still understood it.
And that certainty that everybody craves, I found it in mathematics. Mathematics was the language of certainty. It's so easy compared to anything else I've had to deal with in my life. And this is where I really do get not upset. I find it so interesting that everyone thinks of maths as being hard, whereas it's the easiest thing I know. It's the only thing in the world I know which is easy and simple.
Yes. Wait, yeah, but are you mixing up simple and easy there?
Oh, that's a good question. I honestly don't know. Mathematics has language to describe complexity. I went into knot theory a little bit and so on. And so it actually can describe it. But once you understand it, it's always simple, because the whole point is it can't be complex in some sense, because you should be able to know. You can know things. You know the difference between right and wrong in mathematics. And it's the only thing I know like that. I love it. I do love the mathematics, but it's getting out in the real world and living in complexity and accepting complexity, accepting uncertainty as part of that, and trying to actually navigate that. Oh, I wish I could go back to my ivory tower and just do my maths, but I recognize the importance of it, and I do value it. It's where you can be useful.
So I want to just take us into a slightly different direction now. It came up in a conversation recently about doing no harm. And so I'd like you to say a few words about the role of simplicity and complexity in this principle of not doing any harm.
So hard. And that's why I like being in the ivory tower of just doing the maths, because then at least I was pretty confident I was doing no harm. But even that's not true, because pretty much every advance in war has come from mathematical advances. Historically, that's been the case. And so even in just building out the language of mathematics, almost certainly there is harm that could follow. Doing no harm is one of the hardest things that you can actually do in the big scale of things. The area of mathematics I worked in was algebraic geometry. Very pure. The only application that I was working on, that I was really aware of for the work that I was doing, was string theory. Oh, you can be safe. That's not going to do any harm, is it? Except that, of course, that's also the area which has been used by the military for things like cybersecurity and things like this. The implications of that, I have no idea what they are. So the real principle of doing no harm is almost impossible. There are mathematicians who have taken themselves out of the world Grothendieck is an incredible story that not many people know about. But he was motivated by this idea of doing no harm, and he was really worried that the mathematics that he was at the forefront of, that he was creating, would be used for military purposes and the harm that it could cause. And so he took himself off and became a farmer in southern France, out of a very interesting community there. No, he really kept himself out of the community, but very interesting history and very interesting story, and an amazing mathematician, an inspiration to me in many different ways, but motivated very much by do no harm. So let's come back to this and now take this into our work. I don't know about doing no harm. What I do know is that by not recognizing complexity, it is very likely that there will be harm that you are not thinking about, that you could have avoided. So I think instead of do no harm, which is almost impossible to imagine, it sort of try not to do avoidable harm. And for that, you have to recognize complexity, and you have to be able to work in that complexity to the best of your ability so that you can try to avoid avoidable harm.
Exactly. And that's where sort of thinking from different perspectives and approaches, that's where that comes in then as well.
And observing beyond just the simple thing you're trying to do, observe what's happening around that and outside that. And that means measuring different things in different ways and so on. So there's all sorts of implications that come from this. And it's not easy. We got into this as part of the Responsible AI series a bit, and do no harm in that context with the technology moving as fast as it is basically impossible to guarantee. So this is a genuine challenge. But it's a nice thing to finish, I think, for this particular element on simplicity and complexity. And simplicity, we haven't maybe done enough to instill the virtues of being able to recognize simplicity when you can and make things simple. And maybe I will finish on saying that my coping mechanisms, which served me so well as a child in dealing with people, which I found too complex to be able to understand, to simply accept my ignorance and simplify to the stage where I believed I was prioritizing the things that were most important to me. I was getting down to simplicity for me to make good decisions. And so that's how I lived a lot of my life for a long time, was to say, how do I decide between what is important to me in general? I simplify and I make consistent decisions so that I am dealing with the complexity without getting lost in it. And that simplification is the way I survived. These were coping mechanisms, and I needed them to survive.
But I think everyone does that. And that's what I meant by people categorizing things and just trying to get down to something which they can comprehend or that they can live with in order to not get lost in complexity, as you say.
Exactly. And how you do that, everybody's different in different ways. I don't have any silver bullets there because, of course, having a silver bullet would be obviously wrong because it's complex. But this element of the value and the importance of simplicity within dealing with complexity is important. But I would come back to the fact that for me, simplicity, the easiest language I have to make things simple for me is my love of mathematics. Mathematics is the simplest thing I know. It is exactly what corresponds to the difference between right and wrong and really understanding. And I love it. That, to me, represents simplicity.
Great. I'm not sure how useful that is for anyone else.
No, I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm not always useful. I'm complex.
Exactly. Perhaps we all just need to find our own ideas of what's simple for us or how we define simplicity.
No, I'm going to push back on that in a sense because it comes back to your do no harm. I claim that objectively, mathematics is simple. It's not just that it's simple for me. If you don't have the mathematical language to describe something, you cannot claim that as simplicity because there's almost certainly complexity underlying that. And so you have to recognize the uncertainty and you have to live with the fact that what you're thinking about and what you're doing contains complexity. With mathematics, you don't. With mathematics, you've stripped away everything that matters, everything that's important, until you're just left with something which is simple and pure and either right or wrong. And that is simplicity. And this is very much how I see the world in some ways. And I now try to live in that complex sphere and the complexity and accepting uncertainty as you have to do in that sphere. But to recognize the language of mathematics as that search for simplicity, to be able to articulate elements of the complexity, that's what it is. But anyway, I think we can agree to disagree on this.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of everyone who has difficulty or thinks that they have difficulty understanding maths.
Yes.
Or who has a view of maths, that it is complicated.
And I would argue that the thing that I would challenge them with is a perspective. Actually, let's get down to what really matters about things. And actually, everybody has basic language, which is broadly mathematical, which is things of certainty. If there are 3 things in front of you, you can identify that there are 3. And if there are 4 things in front of you, you can identify that there are 4 of them. And you can identify that those 4 things are more than the 3 things. And these are simple things which are part of everyday language, which people are using, which they're helping them to make decisions in the world. Now, of course, it might be that 3 things are bigger than the 4 things. And so maybe those 3 are bigger than the 4. But that's the complexity that comes from the real world. 3 cows is more than 4 goats.
Exactly.
So that mathematical simplicity is still valuable, but it's only valuable as a language to help people provide little bits of certainty within the word, however simple or complex that their mathematical ability is. This is what helps give them a language to be able to work in that complexity.
Okay, I like that.
And some people have access to more language than others. And
yes.
That is something where, maybe as we think about education in the future, part of what we want to be doing is to be enabling people to have more and better language, to be able to have better discussions and debates. And one of the things that we're finding, I'm observing in the world, is that debate and discussion are often not constructive because they're polarizing. And that might be a language problem. The language of mathematics may or may not help. It's been the cause of a lot of these problems, but that's a whole different episode. Anyway.
Oh, I didn't expect to end up there. Yeah, thank you, David. I'm not sure if that's helped anyone understand the difference between simplicity and complexity or how we work within it.
No, I don't think this has been a particularly helpful episode, but I hope it's been enjoyable and interesting to at least some.
Interesting. Yeah. Thanks.